Okay, well, I think we've got 111 people at the moment, and it's slowed down, 112. Still might be a few more people joining as we go. If Martin, you can hear me okay and see me okay, please unmute and say yes.
Yes.
And you can see the first-hand account screen just fine.
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for joining. This is a great opportunity for everyone. I'm in New York at the moment, my family's place, and it just so happens that my father-in-law, Tom Jorling, someone needs to mute, I believe. Maybe I should try to mute all. I don't know how to mute all. So everybody, please just mute yourself. So anyway, Tom has agreed that to give us a little bit of background about the Clean Water Act and his involvement in it. And it's pardon me, my screen's not cooperating. So to give you a little background about Tom, he graduated from Notre Dame in '62 and went on to get a master's in ecology and a law degree from Boston College. He's had quite a bit of experience within government at the U.S. Department of Interior and at the Smithsonian. And then really the focus of what he's going to talk to you about today is when he was minority counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee for Public Works between '68 and '72, which is when the Clean Water Act was being formulated and ultimately was passed. And then you can see he went on to work at Williams College. He worked for the US EPA for a time during the Carter administration, appointed by Carter. And then Cuomo, I guess the previous Cuomo, Mario Cuomo appointed him to be the DEC chief of New York between '87 and '94. And he did about 10 years in the private sector with International Paper. So in terms of questions, we welcome questions, but since we have so many people on the line, I've asked my lovely wife, Julie, to manage the chat. So if you have any questions along the way, please send a private chat to Julie Jorling. So find Julie Jorling, type in on your chat, Julie, in the search window, and that should come up. And she will pause as appropriate, during the presentation or after the presentation to ask the question. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Jorling, and please enjoy.
All right.
And make sure everybody can hear Tom. If you can't, send Julie a chat.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I consider myself privileged to be speaking to the Ovivo staff. You folks represent the effort to take the vision of clean water to action. By your calculations and designs and installations, you are the ones central to protecting the waters of the United States. I'm also somewhat humbled to be addressing a group about events and activities that occurred 50 years ago, probably before at least some of you were born. And I think back that if I was being asked to listen to a presentation on some historical event 50 years ago, I might be a little bit skeptical. But what I hope to do is cover sort of an amalgam of history, of some refresher of civics and civic processes, as well as address the particular provisions of the Clean Water Act. Public Law 92-500, 92 being the 92nd Congress, and 500 being the 500th law that was enacted in that Congress. So in the introduction, you'll see the reference to social and political context. It's impossible to separate the development of any public policy initiative or action without looking a little bit at the circumstances and the context of the time in which it was developing. And certainly that was an important factor across the board in that period, 1970 roughly to 1980. That's often characterized as the environmental era. It's when a massive amount of legislation was enacted. To give you some context about that, in the 70 to 80 period, there were multiple statutes enacted: clean air, clean water, resources recovery, safe drinking water, Toxic Substances Control Act, culminating with Superfund in 1980. Since that time, there have only been basically 2 environmental statutes enacted in the last almost now 40 years. So it gives you a sense that something was going on in our social context that caused Congress to respond. When we look at that period, we start with 1968. I joined the committee staff in April of 1968, and my colleague who represented the majority, a fellow named Leon Billings, who I may mention a little bit later on, he joined the staff in 66. At the time we joined the staff, we were both 28 years old. So we were certainly young and I guess eager. But when you go back to 68 and you start with sort of the tumultuous times that occurred, you will have some references to certain big ticket items that occurred. The first was the Tet Offensive. In the Vietnam War, it was the countrywide attack by the Viet Cong across all of the cities of Vietnam, and led to the general impression, not just among politicians, but among the people, that the Vietnam War was not going well. It was so effective in causing change that shortly thereafter, Lyndon Johnson, who was the president, announced that he would not seek re-election. And that precipitated then a flurry of activity regarding the Democratic nomination process. But all of it was sort of then subsumed under the April 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King. And when you look at the activities that followed that, the city of Washington was actually consumed with violence and rioting and a lot of tremendous damage, such that President Johnson called in the United States military, the 82nd Airborne, along with National Guard.
Can't hear. Why can't I hear?
That occupied all of the major buildings on Capitol Hill, as well as all federal buildings. And that occupation continued for about eight months, so that when we would come to work in the morning, we would enter the Senate office building, and both sides of that door would be sandbag gun emplacements with troops occupying it 24/7. So it gives you a sense of sort of the degree of the degree of change that was occurring and turmoil that was occurring in the Washington, D.C. area, but it was it represented similar activities in most of the major cities across the country. So it was a very tumultuous time. Shortly after the King assassination, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June of 1968. He had been a candidate for the Democratic nomination, and that threw the Democratic Party into turmoil. And that led to the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968, which, for those of you that are old enough, remember Mayor Daley basically clamped down on all demonstrations and led to considerable violence all around the Democratic Convention. Curiously enough, though, that convention nominated Ed Muskie, the senator from Maine and the chairman of the Subcommittee on Air and Water Pollution of the Committee on Public Works, to be the vice presidential candidate. So 1968 was a tumultuous year, and the members of Congress, all of them, both senators and members of the House, found that their buildings were occupied by protesters, mostly students and from all over the country, occupying the buildings. And so that, for instance, we'd come to work in the morning and the corridor on the 4th floor where the Subcommittee on Public Works was meeting would be filled with sleeping bags with students protesting the war. And they would basically not allow a senator to move from one building to, or one office to another without being besieged by these protesters demanding basically an end to the Vietnam War. So it was in that climate that there was another major emerging movement, and that was what now became known as the environmental movement. And it's interesting to speculate as to why that was occurring. One of the reasons is demonstrated in the slide with the Cayuga River fire in Cleveland, where the river actually had so many hydrocarbons on its surface that it caught fire and became a sort of an icon of how manifestly deteriorating the environment throughout the United States was changing and deteriorating. And that was matched similar by other activities.
Anyway, so he went.
Hey, everybody mute. Pamela, please mute.
That was matched by many episodes of air pollution, which caused fatalities in Birmingham, Alabama, and New York City. So there was a general growing concern over just the deterioration of the environment. And that begins to cause the political process to respond. And another oil spill off Santa Barbara occurred, which caused considerable damage. And Santa Barbara is sort of one of those sacred coast areas, and the folks of that area certainly began to demand some change in response from Congress. Another event occurred in 1969, which was the fulfillment of John Kennedy, President John Kennedy's commitment made in 1960 that the United States would land a man on the moon. And in fact, that landing occurred. And the photographs from those missions changed many's view of how the occupation of the earth by human beings was being threatened. And so that image alone had a tremendous effect on the social and political orientation of not just the United States, but of the country.
I just want to interject. Hi, everybody. Just getting some questions here. And there was a question, if we go back to the Cayuga River, how long did that actually burn? How long was that on fire?
Oh, it burned for over a period of time because there were some, behind that plume of clouds, there were some fixed facilities in the river and along the shore. and those caught fire as well. So it took considerable time to extinguish the fire. And it should be noted also that that was the second time the Cayuga River had caught fire. It had burned about 4 years earlier as well. But the earlier fire did not capture the media's attention and the iconic pictures that came from it that the 1969 fire did.
Cool.
So culminating with the literature that was growing across the country, most often associated with Rachel Carson's book called Silent Spring, but others had written extensively, and also a lot of ecological research began to reach the public consciousness. For instance, wherever fatty tissue in organisms was sampled anywhere in the world, DDT was detected, so that it confirmed the idea that these long-lived molecules move through the biological system all the way across the biosphere. Similar work came from testing or the testing of radionuclides resulting from atmospheric and above ground testing of nuclear weapons, that radioisotopes were found all across the globe in every tissue and every organism, including all human beings, picked up radioisotopes from those tests. And those reports confirmed this idea that things were getting out of control environmentally. And that contributed to the sort of classic outpouring of protests across the country and ultimately around the world, with the first Earth Day in April of April 22nd of 1970. So both the turmoil as well as the emergence of the environmental movement had consequently considerable political effect. Now, let's look a little bit at civics just for the moment. And this is sort of how daunting it is to develop public policy in response to a problem. This timeline indicates basically that from the growing consensus on an issue, problem identification, it then takes Congress at least 1 to 2 years to, through the legislative process, enact legislation. But the legislation itself is only a first step. Then the agency, in this case EPA, has to go through rulemaking. And at this time, EPA was founded in 1970, December 3rd of 1970. It was composed of some small bureaus that were scattered throughout the federal government, in the Interior Department, the Health, Education, and Welfare Department, the Agriculture Department, Atomic Energy Commission, brought them together, and the total complement of people was less than 1,000. And yet they received this authority from Congress, the Clean Air Act in 1970 and the Clean Water Act in 1972. They had to then get the budget authority and the staffing authority to enable them to then begin the rulemaking process. And that took some 5 years. Each of the rules are challenged. Typically, they still are. Every EPA rule is challenged by one or the other parties, usually both, the pro-economic community or the pro-environmental community. And those judicial review processes take several years, and then the implementation and enforcement. So the process can take as long as 15 years before it reaches full implementation and the results produced. That has obviously been behind the changes that occurred in Congress. This is real civics lesson. This is the standard legislative process that is followed in order for an idea to reach the point of public law. We have two chambers of our Congress, the Senate and the House. They both pursue the similar process. A bill is introduced, it's referred to committees, hearings are held. Markup is the key period when the legislation is actually written. And through the period of the 70s, the early 70s, markups were closed. That meant that there was no coverage or no public attendance at the markup sessions. They were held only with the members and with staff. When markup was completed, the committee would then report the bill to the floor for action, and that would lead to debate, amendments, and votes. Presumably, there's differences between the two chambers' products, and those have to go to conference committee, and that conference committee resolves so that both chambers have the same legislation before them and contained in the report of the conferees. There's a vote on conference. Then both chambers have approved the conference committee report. It goes to the president for signature or veto. The Clean Air Act in 1970 went to the president for signature. The 1972 Clean Water Act resulted in a veto by President Nixon, and that veto had to be overridden by both the House and the Senate. Okay. So that process was extensive. The committee, and we're speaking only of our committee, 33 days of hearings, 44 days in markup in sub and full committee, 1 day of debate, amendments, and a vote, and 39 days of conference committee meetings on the Clean Water Act. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but the differences between the two chambers had sort of underpinnings in their respective orientations. The Senate was much more oriented towards developing a satisfactory regulatory program. The House was more interested in approving extensive financial assistance to state and local governments for the construction of waste treatment plants. And so the conference sort of had to leverage those two orientations in order to produce consensus, which ultimately was produced, and the matter went through the remainder of the process and resulted in the adoption of Public Law 92-500. I thought this would just be informative about how the legislative process was conducted then, back in the 70s, and the way it is conducted more typically now with the current Congress. And this is a sort of a graphic of the way the tax bill was established. The entirety of the markup was completed in the majority leader's office or the Speaker of the House's office, and at this time, both chambers were controlled by the Republicans. Those few Republicans then drafted a bill and then presented it out of the majority and Speaker's House only after the Speaker and the majority leader of the Senate agreed that they had enough votes in their chamber to pass it. And so it went very quickly through the rest of the process and reached the president. All of that took place in about a 14-day period, a week to 14-day period. So there was very little interaction with other members of the Senate and House, no interaction with the public, no public opportunity to speak in hearings. So it was a very different kind of process than the one that produced the Clean Water Act. And I believe the reason the Clean Water Act has been so successful is because it did go through that extensive process and produce respected and durable law. Okay.
I do have a question. Emily Edwards is asking, to what extent does lobbying come into play for this type of legislation? And I'm guessing, do you mean the Water Act? Probably not so much the tax bill. And is it necessary for our company to have a presence in these processes?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's one that doesn't admit to an easy answer. With respect to lobbying, that has changed dramatically, beginning pretty much in this same period. But the K corridor, as they call it, the K Street corridor in Washington, which is now hundreds of glass buildings, glass encased buildings, is filled with lobbyists. In 1970 and 72, there were very few lobbyists, and they were typically the trade associations of businesses, but companies did not have their own representation in Washington. And there was very little in the way of sophisticated lobbying on the part of the NGO community, the non-governmental community. But these statutes, and there were others at this same time, surface mining and others, began to change the sort of lobbying landscape. And so now it is very strong in its effect on the legislative process. It was not as strong as in the period of the 70-72. Very rarely would the senators receive direct communication from an industry or an industry group. So it is much different, and it's going to continue to be much different, especially as, if we get time toward the end, we'll talk about some of the influences that are changing that, primarily money. So we'll come back to that, but I'm sure that Ovivo is a part of a trade association of some sort that does have Washington representation. The question, I know when I was in international paper, whether the company should rely only on its trade association versus direct representation. And the company concluded it should have direct representation because, in shorthand, the trade associations tend to represent the lowest common denominator of their industry, and not necessarily the most directly influential of the industry groups.
It sounds like Ovivo's representation is NACWA, and do you say NACWA?
NACWA.
NACWA in the
It's
business.
mine, yeah.
And they have lobbying representatives in Washington.
Okay, so there's a partial answer. So, okay, we can, this chart gives you some sense of how much activity there was in Congress, especially preceding the 72 Act. There were several statutes enacted by various Congresses that attempted to address water pollution. The important thing is that by 1972, there was dissatisfaction that those earlier laws were producing the results. And so the Congress, and that also occurred with air pollution in the 1970 context. So Congress began to change its entire orientation towards environmental regulation with the 70 Clean Air Act and the 72 Clean Water Act. If we move on, it gives you a graphic of a timeline of some of those earlier statutes, as well as the amendments and activities that have occurred subsequently. I'm going to touch now on sort of what I'll consider as the beginnings of the modern era of water pollution control legislation, which culminated with the 72 amendments. The earlier legislation basically gave support to the government, the federal government, to do research and development, which turns out to be very important. A lot of the protocols for testing and what have you were developed through that research. there was literally no effective enforcement. And the underlying philosophy of the statute, if you could call it that, was the beneficial uses of the natural water system, the classification based on beneficial uses. And those beneficial uses included the treatment of waste. So that by the 70s and the continued deterioration of the water, Congress began to change its underlying philosophy about what regulatory legislation should entail. The first place that the modern process started was a statute enacted in the spring of 1970 called the Water Quality Improvement Act. It was our committee's response to primarily oil spills, which there were many. There were several ship releases that occurred in the two-year period before that, including the Santa Barbara oil well blowout. So that Congress then changed the rules completely on oil spills. They created a notice requirement that if you, an owner or operator of a facility or a vessel, released an amount of oil that produced a visible sheen in the water, you had a duty with criminal enforcement backing it to report to the government about the spill. And then the spill, the legislation gave authority for the government to respond to those spills with some resources, but created a liability provision called strict and general liability for the owner operator, that they would have to pay for the costs of not only the cleanup, but also damages produced in the environment. So it changed the nature. The purpose of that very stringent liability rule was to improve the standard of care in the way people managed oil and hazardous substances. There were a couple of other provisions in that legislation which were carried over in the 72 Act, but it was the first really stringent provision in the water pollution area that Congress had enacted. So then we move to the 1972 Act. And here we have some important considerations. The picture that's before you now shows 5 members of the subcommittee, 5 of 7 members of the subcommittee. And these were the crucial players in the development of the legislation. Senator Muskie was the chairman of the subcommittee and was responsible to craft the legislation. And in order to do that, he had to draw on his skill as a legislator and bring along the other members. So if you look at this picture and you see Senator Eagleton, Senator Eagleton was of the view that Congress in these earlier legislation had made promises to the American people that they were going to control water pollution and air pollution. And he said, but Congress did not provide the regulatory tools to bring about that result. And he was insistent that when this law was going to be passed, it would produce the results of improving and cleaning the waterways of the United States. And he became, in effect, the champion for deadlines and mandatory duties on the part of government. The deadlines to achieve results, and if those results weren't achieved, those deadlines could be enforced including through citizen suits. So he was the father of, in effect, the idea of deadlines and mandatory duties. Senator Baker, a Republican of Tennessee, and really one of the, as I consider all 5 of these members, one of the really truly great Americans. He has an interesting background, but also because he represented the state of Tennessee, it included Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And Oak Ridge National Laboratory at that time was directed by a very close personal friend of Senator Baker. And Senator Baker had the orientation that you had to establish what was necessary in law, and then there would be a response from the scientific and technological community to produce the technologies to respond to that mandate. And so he became the father, both in the Clean Air Act context and clean water, of technology forcing. Now another element of technology forcing was produced because of the histories of these individuals. All of them were World War II veterans. And that shared service produced an attitude that that politics really was subordinate to the need to respond to the issue. And part of their orientation produced from that experience was in the military during World War II, if something was needed, it was produced. And that had influence over them. It was also influenced by the fact that Kennedy said, we're going to put a man on the moon in a decade. And indeed, with that driver, the man on the moon landed in 1969. So Baker was then known as the father of technology forcing. Senator Cooper, who was technically my boss, he was the ranking member of the committee and therefore hired the minority staff. He was a stickler for administrative process. His view, just to give an example, the administration had proposed administrative penalties for violations of the law to the point of $50,000 and a year in jail. And this grated Senator Cooper's sense of constitutional practice that if you're going to charge somebody with $50,000 and up to a year in jail, that is not a civil penalty, that is a criminal penalty, and the defendants had to have the criminal defenses available. But he was also very supportive of the idea of controlling the effluence, and very important because what he brought along was a great deal of influence throughout the Republican Party. So this group was the group that primarily produced the Senate legislation. Okay. You get a sense of that from some of the sort of media attention at the time that Senator Muskie became known as Mr. Clean. And it's also interesting that Senator Muskie, in pursuing the vice presidential nomination in 1968, unsuccessfully, the pundits labeled him as the likely Democratic nominee in 1972. And through today's lens of politics, you would say, oh my goodness, here you had a budding presidential candidate. It must have produced partisanship within the committee. And there was not a shred of it. And the interesting thing about that is because of the relationship between and among these senators. And it wasn't as if they weren't without presidential ambitions of their own. Of the 9 members, it was elevated to 9 members by 72. Of the 9 members, 5 of them had been presidential aspirants. On the majority side, Muskie and Eagleton and Birch Bayh from Indiana were various times candidates for president. And on the Republican side, Senator Baker and Dole were aspirants to be president. So even though they had that kind of ambition, they still operated in a manner that reflected no divisiveness or games playing among themselves. I'll tell one quick story to give you a sense of how the relationships among senators occurred. My boss, Senator Cooper, told the story that during the 1960 election, the presidential election, he was also running for re-election for senator from Kentucky. And John Kennedy was flying from Chicago to Louisville for a campaign event. And during that flight, he was being briefed on his appearance in Louisville, Kentucky. And among the information he was receiving was who was going to be at the event and on the dais with him. And he's looking through that list and he sees the Democratic candidate running against John Sherman Cooper. And Kennedy takes his pen out and he strikes that person from the list and says, I'm not going to have the person running against my friend John Cooper on the dais with me. So that you had that sense of collegiality. Cooper and Kennedy were close friends when John Kennedy was a senator. Another example is the Democratic candidate for Tennessee against Howard Baker wanted Muskie to participate in the campaign. And Muskie refused. He said, I will not go to Tennessee and campaign against my friend Howard Baker. So it was a different time. And this fellow Leon Billings and I used to struggle with the question, why did that occur? What was it about these individuals, about the legislative process at that time, that produced that kind of collegiality and willingness to work together to produce events? And we may get some chance to talk about that. This picture is a favorite of mine. It's probably the only political picture I have left. With Senator Muskie and Leon Billings, who was my counterpart, meeting in Senator Muskie's office about something. I can't quite remember what, but it was a period. And to give you another example of the bipartisanship or even nonpartisanship that occurred, none of the Republican members of the Senate would hesitate to call up Leon, the majority staff person, and talk about an issue or a concern in the legislation. Similarly, no member of the Democratic side of the committee would hesitate to call me up and ask questions about citizen suits or enforcement. So it was not just among the senators, but it also continued among the staff and had great consequence in the formation of the legislation. Another question.
We got a question. Kimberly's curious about what the EPA and DEQ do when a city violates one or more laws. And she's citing an example from the city of Sandy in Utah in 2019. I remember this, yes. Overfed the fluoride into the water supply. And additionally, if there are health problems that occur due to that overfeed, how should that be handled?
Well, that's a Safe Drinking Water Act question, more than Clean Water Act, but the same issue appears about enforcement against cities on the waste treatment performance. It's always a very difficult set of challenges and justifies a lot of the money that the federal government has contributed to cities for compliance. The interesting thing that changed with the 72 Act that compelled much higher levels of performance from public authorities, public system, was the inclusion of citizen suits. While the federal and state agencies might be somewhat reticent about bringing an enforcement action against a city because of financial concerns or political concerns or what have you, the citizens aren't so bound. And so citizen suits have driven a lot of improvements in performance of cities that the government enforcement agencies have been unable to produce. So citizen suits have been a very important factor in the Clean Water Act, not just against private dischargers, but also against public dischargers. But the issue about non-compliance by public authorities is a challenging one. And the one thing that Bill Ruckelshaus did when he became administrator is he identified a whole bunch of democratic cities that were not in compliance to bring enforcement action. And even the threat of that caused significant changes in the response. But it is inherently a difficult question of one public agency bringing an enforcement action against another public agency, and it gets complicated. But I think it usually leads to the threat of enforcement action, negotiation on consent decrees that provide a new timetable and new sets of requirements without seeking the more traditional enforcement. Okay. This I included because it's sort of the statutory approach dilemma. The committee that I worked for had the orientation that Congress had the responsibility to say what was to be achieved, and to do that as specifically as possible. And to give you a sense of this is this graphic. For instance, in the auto emission area, the 1970 Act included a provision that said automobiles manufactured after a certain date had to reduce their discharges 90% below a base year. So that sounds very specific. Very little discretion on the part of the administering agency, EPA, to decide what level of control should be established for the automobile. But even within that kind of specificity, there is a range of what is called here discretion. 90% of what? The test procedure determines what 90% is measured. And then there's a huge question in the automobile case about whether the standard applies to each and every produced or the average of production. So even in that area, there's discretion. So if you put a line across these circles, on the one side of that line, you could say the pro-business orientation, or on the other side, the pro-environment. It's the amount of discretion that the administering agency has to choose what levels of control are actually established. And in the clean water context, for instance, there are terms like best practicable technology, best available technology. What do those terms mean? Who decides it? Who has the data to establish it? All of those are the questions that are raised in trying to craft legislation. And the Clean Water Act moves in the direction of more specificity. Contrast that to several other statutes, including the earlier water statute, where the reference was the standard should be what's unreasonable risk to injury, taking into account economic and technical feasibility. The questions that are associated with that give considerable latitude to the agency in deciding what level of control that represents. So those are the questions that the statute has to face. And when we turn to the 72 Act, some of the most significant changes, the earlier orientation, as I mentioned, was the use of water, the beneficial use of the natural water system. In the 72 Act, it was shifted to an ecological orientation. And that was stated in Section 101, the biological, physical, and chemical integrity of the nation's waters. So the orientation was not to use water, but to protect the ecosystems of water. That was a major change. And then the specifics to back that up were that the discharge of any pollution was prohibited. It's unlawful to discharge with the qualification without a permit. And so the question becomes, well, what does that permit charge. And that's where those terms like best available technology or best practical technology. But in the 72 Act, there was a floor established. And it was first established in the context of public systems, and that was the minimum level of treatment. All parties, all dischargers, public dischargers had to meet secondary treatment. The question was, what does secondary treatment mean to an industrial discharger? And it became basically the same measure, that secondary treatment removes roughly 85 to 90% of the pollution loading, so that the level of control for industries should be in that same range. And that became known as the best practicable treatment. So it established a technological floor, and that technological floor had to be met by everybody, no matter where they discharged or what the character of the waterway was into which they discharged. A lot of people complained about that, but the real basic reason there is to prevent the environment from becoming basically a negotiation tool for economic development, so that everybody had to meet that same standard. The other elements that are important, the enforcement regime was changed considerably. Instead of enforcing a violation of a water quality standard, which is an almost impossible burden on the government, the enforcement was directed at violation of permit conditions. There's another area that the statute changed considerably, which is still litigated by the U.S. Supreme Court, and that is the waters of the United States. The effort of the statute was to have the reach of the regulatory program be as close as possible to the hydrologic cycle, so that no matter where you interfered with the hydrologic cycle, you were subject to the regulation of the statute. That has been back and forth between Corps of Engineers and EPA, establishing how to measure the waters of the United States. It's been before the Supreme Court on 3 different occasions. Most recently, a decision issued in this term involving a community in Hawaii, which discharged its effluent into groundwater, which moved through the groundwater into the ocean, and whether or not that discharge was included within the Clean Water Act. And the Supreme Court just ruled, yes, it is. It's subject to all of the rules and regulations of the Clean Water Act. So it was a happy occasion when that decision was reached. I mentioned that part of the purpose of the act was to avoid pollution havens. Another way of addressing the pollution haven issue is that wherever you built a new facility, a new discharging facility, that facility would be subject to the new source performance standards, which were best available control technology applied. So wherever you built, whether you built on the Mississippi River or you built on some pristine stream in upstate New York, you had to meet that minimum level of control. So with that, let's turn to either Q&A or with that.
Yeah, so yeah, that's kind of an overview of how it all went down in the 1970s. Tom, thank you very much. And I think now if people just have any specific questions about anything they can ask, they can send a text to Julie, or I send a chat to Julie, and then she can either call on you to ask specifically or read it off. But it's really a key piece of legislation back in that day, and it's really difficult for many of us to even understand what times were like. I mean, we take for granted that we can jump in just about any river, lake, and stream, and it's safe, and that just was not the case 50 years ago. And the regulations fundamentally of what were put in place then, the framework of it, is the same thing we deal with today when we're designing plants, where the states now have the primacy, meaning the ability to enforce, in most cases, the Clean Water Act and on behalf of the federal government. Tom may have better words to how to say that. And so we're always getting information from our customers on the permits and what they think the NPDES permit is going to say. And then we're providing our recommendations as Ovivo, what we think the best technology is to achieve those. So with that, I'm going to give it back to Tom. And if there aren't any specific questions, he can give you a little flavor of why he thinks the legislative process is different today than it was back 50 years ago. He's got a few points to make on that if people are interested. But if anybody'd like to share, I'm going to turn it back over to Tom.
I got some questions. This is awesome. So with the latest overturning of the Clean Water Bill by the administration in 2019, does that mean we have to go back through the entire 6 to 15 year process again to get back to the 2018 level of treatment requirements?
Well, I hope the answer is no, because the shorthandedly called rollbacks that the administration, they're now up to, I think, 90 attempted rollbacks of regulations under clean air and clean water and RCRA and Superfund. Those attempted rollbacks are now being litigated. For instance, I just participated in filing an amicus brief, which is a friend of the court brief, on the rollback regarding auto emission standards by the government. So it depends first on how long and what rulings the courts make on these efforts to roll back regulations. With respect to the one that the current administration is attempting to roll back, which is the waters of the United States, the recent Supreme Court ruling, I think, sends a strong message that won't be successful. So we're in a very uncertain period. I know a lot of the NGO community is litigating extensively on all of the rules that the administration is proposing, in the hope that by at least having them in the judicial process, that the November election will moot a lot of those efforts very quickly. But it is still a challenge. The elections have consequences, and the ability to roll back rules is inherent in the power of the executive. So it's something that is uncertain at this time more than anything.
Let's move on to this, which is, were there provisions or regulations that you were unsuccessful in implementing? And are there those that you really wish had been created or would be more or most effective today?
Well, during the period when I served as assistant administrator of EPA, we promulgated an extensive set of rules, almost all related to the effluent guidelines for industry subcategories, and I think those rules have withstood the test of time. It's interesting to go back to about the process of reaching what levels of control we would choose in a rule for, say, iron and steel or organic chemicals or whatever industry category. We used an analytical method on which we just referred to as a cost-effective curve. And so most of the rules, we choose a place on that curve, which got close to an 80 or 90% reduction. And I think they were basically sound and have withstood the test of time. There are some that might have gone a little bit higher on the cost-effective curve because one of the things that happens with cost-effective curves is as soon as it becomes a requirement, the technological community comes up with many ways of achieving that level of reduction or even a greater level of reduction at a much lower cost level than the assessments of cost at the time the rule is written. And that has happened repeatedly. I know we had some efforts to go back and look at what the cost estimate was at the time a rule was promulgated and compare it to the actual cost of compliance that was realized. And in all cases, we found that the cost of compliance actually realized was much lower than the cost of that we estimated it would be. And that was primarily as a result of the technological community coming in with more cost-effective ways of achieving levels of reduction than previous. So there was one rule that we promulgated in 1998, I guess, which hadn't succeeded and was challenged by the chemical industry in the Western District of Louisiana, of all places, because that's now the petrochemical area of the world. And the court issued us an injunction. And so what we did then is choose to negotiate with the industry to come up with a fix to that we asked Congress then, after we reached agreement, to enact, which they did. And so the rule actually did go forward. But I can't point to any that I would say I think we could have done better, but it's always a challenge in that. I could tell stories about how do you set the level of cadmium for sewage sludge to be spread on agricultural lands, but that would take too much time.
Yeah, I just to add, Tom, here, that's a big role for Ovivo, right? When it comes to regulations ratcheting down the requirements, they rely on companies like Ovivo and others to be able to meet those. We're the ones who come up with that technology for the most part in this country.
Yeah, and it's an interesting interaction, and it's one that you can push so far. You can't push toward the point of craziness, but Senator Baker made a believer out of everybody on the committee and committee staff that there were no limits to what we could achieve if we decided to achieve it. And he just tried to drive it through statutes, and it has worked. The automobile is an example that he was particularly concerned with, and it has had success. And the result was that catalytic converter makers and the chambers that hold the catalytic converter, the catalyst, are advanced very, very rapidly once the requirement became for the 90% reduction. Is there any others?
Yeah, let's do a couple more. Oh, we got more. So going back, I guess, to the NGOs that you said are litigating now, maybe? What are there some of the new proposed rules that are more concerning to them than others?
Yes, there are some rules which are especially problematic because they would create loopholes in compliance that could result in very serious changes in the environment. The Waters of the United States rule being one of them, by opening up more places to release pollutants or to impair wetlands which are regulated under the Clean Water Act, it could result in adverse effects on water quality. And it's interesting, just as an aside, Tom mentioned about the successes that these statutes have achieved. I know when I was a kid growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, the last place that your parents would allow you to go was anywhere near the river. The river, the Ohio River there was literally a sewage, an open sewage duct. I visited a couple of times recently, and on a clear summer day now, the boating traffic on the Ohio River, including contact water sport, is unbelievable. You think you're in Nantucket or something with the number and character of the vessels that are now using the Ohio River. Boston Harbor was a sacrifice area. The property along the harbor was derelict and of no value. Now it's the most prized real estate in Massachusetts. And Leanne and I used to joke that if we could just get a little cut of all of the increased property values along the shore and riverfronts, we would have been able to retire very long ago. But it's been dramatic, and the key to that is not backsliding. So it's a challenge. Let me just jump to one slide here. There are a couple of slides here that you're all free to look at as you find interesting. But the question of why did it work then and why does it work now? I've touched on the fact that the senators were very different critters than they are now. As Leanne and I used to joke, none of the members of the Senate committee that we worked for could run for election in today's world. It was not something they could do. They just wouldn't stoop to the kind of activities that a senator has to perform now in order to be reelected. And so what in this then and now list that you have in the slides, there's how many? 18 total. There are a number of things that Leon and I spent a long time trying to establish differences between now and then. We started with a list of about 40 and then distilled it down to these 18. Some are more important than others. But the one that stands out the most is the amount of money that it now takes to run for Senate and House of Representatives. A friend of mine who ran successfully for Congress in New York, downstate New York in Westchester County, he had to spend every day raising $20,000 a day for 2 years in order to run for reelection. That completely distorts, one, their ability to engage in the legislative process. It distorts their daily activity. They have, curiously, there are rules of the House and the Senate that a member cannot raise money in the Senate office buildings or in the Capitol. So both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have these buildings right adjacent to these structures in which they have phone banks, offices with phones. And so every morning the members go to those offices and spend a considerable amount of time. Staff has already furnished them. You've got to talk to these 10 possible donors today. And so they make those phone calls raising money. Then they go back. So it completely distorts their whole orientation, not just because of the need to raise money, but the amounts of money are staggering. When Muskie ran for re-election in the Senate in 1976, or no, excuse me, 72, I believe it was, he had to raise $100,000. And he did that with one phone call to a labor union in Maine. A Maine senator, especially in the contest that's being waged in Maine now, each of those senators could spend as much as $50 million, each of those candidates, as much as $50 million running for Senate in Maine. To raise that kind of money I think it obvious distorts people's orientation towards their job. And for instance, one of the things that's pointed out here, how do you raise money? Well, one of the ways you raise money is you get FaceTime on the 24/7 cable news cycle, because the more FaceTime you get on TV, the easier it is for you to raise money. So these senators become talking heads. And then how do you get on it repeatedly? You get on it repeatedly by usually some variant of negative advertising. The media love candidates who will say nasty things about their opponents. There's nothing that drives the viewership up than that practice. So you can imagine what that does to collegiality among members once they're in the chamber. So it's a multi-faceted phenomena that has changed the political system over the succeeding years, and I think we haven't seen the end of it. One of the questions we had earlier was about lobbyists. Well, point number 8 gives a little bit of flavor of how the lobbying world has changed, and you can look at that. Number 11 was a pet peeve of mine. When we had a committee hearing, usually at least 7 members of the subcommittee would show up and sit through that hearing. And as you saw from that earlier chart, 33 days of hearing. Now members don't sit through hearings at all, and they don't become real students of the topic on which they are undertaking that solemn responsibility of writing a law. So there are a number of these that sort of feed each other and interact with each other to produce a very changed world from the one that we occupied. The last one is sort of a summary of the cost of campaigning. I've described the cost associated with apologies to the company, the 3 M: money, media, and manipulation. In the not too distant future, each voter will receive a personally crafted ad that is designed to appeal to them. And that ad will be based upon the information that the political consultant system can produce through access to all kinds of data banks. And they will know more about you than you know about yourself. And they will then craft an ad that will be sent specifically to your social media. I call that kind of a kind of manipulation, and it's often very scary, because the algorithms now that can milk those data banks can identify your personality type, what your fears and concerns and everything else are, in ways that can be exploited by the political campaigning process. It's all fed by money. The question I used to get is, what is all that money used for that's being raised in these campaigns? And my answer is, it's being raised to develop the kind of methods that I was just describing, and they're getting more and more effective all the time. Running out of time?
Yeah, we're about out of time, but I think we have one more question.
And it's not so much as a question, but maybe to get away from the political right now and go back to water and the success of the Clean Water Act. That Daniel, who lives in Cleveland and Akron area, just says, thanks to the Clean Water Act, the Cayuga River was named River of the Year in 2019. So that's huge. And then just to kudos to Ovivo and all of the stuff that you guys have done that you guys changed the biosolids rule with your research and time curve of aerobic digestion. So
Algae based, yeah.
yeah. And is that part of thickened aerobic digestion also? See, look at me, I'm learning. Anyway, so yay, Ovivo.
No, that was the White House document, Tom, that we did the aerobic
Oh, that
digestion.
one, yeah.
Yeah, we had actually an EPA representative, and based on that, we changed the White House document. So they gave us a reduction in the thickened aerobic. We haven't done the algae yet.
Oh, that's great.
Get on it. That's it.
Well, with that, we're just out of time. If there's no more questions, I wanted to thank everybody for joining. I think it was a really interesting talk. We got into a little bit of politics, but just remember that this is not one-sided politics. It happens on all parties and all walks of life. And I think these are good observations where we are today and where we were then. And that's why we could pass, or why Tom and his group of people could pass such resounding legislation that generally had very, very wide support. There's always a few distractors, but it still remains, generally speaking, a very widely supported piece of legislation today for what it does. So thanks, Tom, for that talk. And if there's any other further questions or people want follow-up, should they contact me, contact you? What do you?
That would be fine. Yeah.
You want to give your?
Yeah, just tjorling@roadrunner.com. I can't handle the kind of machine displays that Tom has put together here for this presentation, but I'd be happy to try and respond. And also, as I said at the outset, I've always considered the work that you're doing as the real environmentalism. It's the without which we don't get there from here. And so keep up the good work. And I hope that you can keep coming up with some innovations that will drive down the cost. And also just a concluding comment on that Cleveland person. There's a friend of mine who's a federal judge in Toledo, and he's dealing with a case on the eutrophication and algal blooms of Lake Erie. He's got a case pending before him right now, so I don't comment with him on that, but the issues are still great. We didn't talk much about non-point sources. That's the principal cause of the nutrient flows into Lake Erie. There are provisions, not direct regulation as there is in the point source context, but there are some provisions that can help in the area of non-point sources. But it is an area that I think we'll see more legislative attention paid in the future years.